this election having gone for Trump narrowly, it's getting more narrow by the hour, as you know. This is nothing of a mandate. That's the most ridiculous thing. But I will say that they're screaming mandate, and they do have, all three chambers, if you will, both chambers on the Hill, and they have the executive branch. And of course, the Supreme Court is a concierge Supreme Court that Trump has put in place. So I don't know if there's a mandate, but there certainly is a power base. But that said, the election itself that produced that slim victory, we do need to look at what happened. And we do need to understand our country. And I thought it interesting, the campaign that Kamala Harris ran. As you know, I felt that in the short time she had, she actually did very, very well. She's not the person that I would have chosen. She, I feel, is a flawed candidate in many ways that don't have to do with her competence. They have to do with her ability to campaign and audition well. When you campaign and audition well, you're unflappable in a back and forth with whomever is interviewing you. So it doesn't matter if you are on 60 Minutes, Joe Rogan, or The View. You are comfortable enough with where you are in terms of your positions, in terms of what you're going to say, in terms of your messaging, that you're able to handle all those things. Kamala Harris, to me, had a soft spot there. I just thought she wasn't as strong. But listen, it's not easy, okay? It's not. I thought Kamala Harris, and I think Kamala Harris is an impressive person. It's just that I felt she was a flawed candidate. So look, so I hope, because I know I'm going to get angry emails. I always get them when I'm critical at all of Kamala Harris. But I wanted to acknowledge at the same moment, which is what I just did, that she ran, I felt, an extremely energetic and almost flawless campaign from the standpoint of the candidate, from what she was asked to do, given who she is and the limitations that she has. But I always wondered exactly what was going down in her campaign and exactly how decisions were being made on commercials they were running, on different forums in which she was appearing, the issues that they felt they should most underscore, how much of the campaign was attacking Trump, and how much of the campaign was introducing a candidate that most of America didn't know. So when I heard an interview that just dropped with the Kamala Harris people, I thought I'd share just a little bit of it with you. Now, David Plouffe is he's sort of the genius Democratic campaign strategist who went over to the Harris campaign when she entered the race. And he speaks first here, and then I'll share you a little bit more. And we'll talk on the other side of it. But here it is, David Plouffe talking about the campaign.
Kamala Harris started this race, if I recall, with favorable 33 to 35. She ended it at 48. She actually ended the election with a higher approval rating than Donald Trump. I'm not sure someone's won the presidency with a lower approval rating. So I think as people got to know her, they liked her. I think her approval rating now post-election is north of 50. That was really hard work. And I will say that, think about if Kamala Harris had come out of a process that was traditional, running in and winning a primary, so maybe become the nominee in March or April. You spend a month, 6 weeks on your biography. You keep coming back to it. You define the Trump first term. You raise the stakes of what a Trump second term would be like. You have like a month just to run paid advertising on things like housing and your tax cut. So this is where there was a price to be paid for the short campaign. And you can't even say 107 days, because to Quentin's point, some of that was spent shoring up the Democratic nomination. Then you really have to have said everything you want to say by the time people start voting early. So we had a little more than 2 months to do bio, contrast on the economy, on healthcare, raising the stakes of Trump. So yes, when you have a race where you've got the current incumbent president with approval ratings of, let's say, 38 to 40, never in history have we had this before, at least since, I guess, Grover Cleveland. So once you have a former president running where 48 to 51% of the people approve of his first term, and people are dissatisfied with the direction of the country, you have to raise the stakes of what a second term would be like. So I think for us, we spent much more time trying to raise the stakes of a second term than re-arbitrating the first, because voters just weren't open to that. So that's why pointing out, his tariff and what that would mean in terms of a huge sales tax for the American people, the fact that he's more unhinged, he wants unchecked power. Project 2025 ended up being about as popular as the Ebola virus. So we did a lot of good work there. And now, of course, the son of a bitch lied about it, and he's hiring everybody who authored it. Project 2025 is going to be the Trump administration agenda, as we pointed out. So we had to do that. So if we had just run a race solely on Kamala Harris positives, though we did a lot of that on what Kamala Harris wants to do on the economy, we did a lot of that. It's worth reminding your listeners who live in California, New York, or Alabama or Florida, you're not experiencing the presidential race as it's experienced in Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina. We spent a lot of time, she spent a lot of time driving a core economic message. But in our view, that was not enough. When you've got someone whose first term was judged favorably enough by enough people to give him the election, and people are dissatisfied about where you are now, and you're part of that administration, you have to basically raise the stakes. And for us, it was on the economy. It was on the fact that all the people who stood in his way last time were warning us about him. It was about Project 2025. It was about abortion. And, I think we did a good job of that based on our data, but we had to stay on that. So I think that is an incredibly faulty reading, that what we should have done is just lift up Kamala Harris. We clearly did. Her favorability rating increased by, I believe, 15 points. If you look at who do you trust more to look out for people like your family, who do you think is going to fight for the middle class? Huge progress for Kamala Harris. Even on crime and immigration, we were able to make double-digit progress. So we were very focused on lifting her up. But to win a race like this, given the political atmospherics, which were quite challenging, we had to raise the risk of a Trump second term.
Jen, so that was really, I thought, a really good drill down on what happened, and in that couple of minutes, he reviewed for you the situation they had, which was quite unique in that you had this candidate dropped into the race with 100-odd days left. And I saw in the chat, everybody knew who she was. This guy, it was People's Republic of Santa Monica says everyone knew who she was. She was the VP for 4 years. Well, that's just not true, People's Republic of Santa Monica. She was actually not known to a bunch of the public, and that's not just my opinion. That there were numerous polls that showed you that. So if you follow that bouncing ball at all, you know that that's true. That is to say, the public that is well informed, following politics, of course, you knew who she was, but most of the public didn't. I mean, based on polling, I know it's incredible. She's the vice president. How can you say that? Well, it's true. And it's also true that you can know someone's the vice president and still have no sense of who they are. And I think that's really generally the relationship that Americans have with their vice president. I mean, did you know really much about Mike Pence? Did you know that, he was governor of Indiana? Did you know what he did when he was governor of Indiana? So if he was running, he'd have to establish a lot of sort of the policy blanks that were left out and fill those in, and then you get it. So I thought that was a reasonable point, and he's saying we have to do that while we're concurrently featuring the threat that Donald Trump's second term would be. Everything from Project 2025 to the tariffs and to the immigration issue. So you have to essentially create all of these different messages, and you have to do it in a very compact time period. So, as you know, I felt one of the key decisions that the Trump people made, and it was an effective decision, was to run a commercial that was almost the perfect commercial, because it was she's going to raise your taxes. She supported your taxpayer money being used for trans surgeries for illegals in our prisons. That's all and then there was one of them even had a little piece with Charlemagne the God and her speaking on that podcast. So I thought that was an effective spot. And the counterpunch spot didn't run nationally. It ran in the swing states. But I felt that the Democrats lost some ground because of the effectiveness of that spot. Now, they have actual research on that spot. And they say that actually that spot didn't really affect people in swing states to the extent that I would think. But that said, someone else in this team, and this team that's being interviewed, again, it's not just Pluff. It's now let me give you the it's the main people, the working staff that were working the campaign for Kamala Harris. So you had Pluff, as I mentioned, that Jen O'Malley Dillon and Quentin Folks, along with Stephanie Cutter. Now, you're not going to hear from all of them, but at least know that those are the real insiders. I mean, this is the top of the mothership that ran Kamala Harris's campaign. Here's a little bit more from the conversation, and they addressed that spot I was talking about as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, I think people, when they vote for president, want to vote about the
Stop
future.
1 second, Tony. This does relate to also the need to, and this is something I haven't touched on yet, to individuate, right? To somehow make yourself distinct from the Biden administration, because you know the Biden administration isn't popular, but at the same time, you are part of the administration, and you also want to take credit for some of the stuff that's gone down that's been positive during a Biden administration. So you're in a tough spot. This kind of, I think, relates in part to that. Go ahead, Tony.
And they saw in the vice president someone they didn't know a lot about a background. So, you know, who she was, what she stood for, what she did as vice president. So in every step of what we were trying to do, we had to tell a pretty robust story in one ad or one policy rollout or one event that you don't often have to do because of the time we were in. But I do think that we really focused from the get-go on how she was different than everyone else, different than Joe Biden, different than Donald Trump. And at the end of the day, the choice was her versus Donald Trump. And at the same time, you know, she was very clear that she was a new generation of leadership, but it wasn't just like a statement. It was, here's what I need to focus on. Her first policy announcements were economic, talking about housing, talking about lowering costs, understanding that people really didn't feel like things were progressing in the way that they wanted to, a la the right track, wrong track data, but how she brought her own point of view to thinking about housing, sandwich generation. That was probably her biggest applause line.
And so you could see that the biggest applause line that they refer to kind of helps them establish an issue that they feel should be concentrated upon. And so that was that. Back to that, Tony, if you would.
Her life and also understanding what people in the country were really needing. So I think that in a 107-day race, it is very difficult to do all the things you would normally do in a year and a half, 2 years. But I think wherever we had an opportunity, the vice president did put her own stamp on this and did it in a deeper way than I think probably we got the kind of full breadth of coverage on it. Of course, you know, when you have an administration that a lot of progress has been made and you're part of that progress, it's complicated when you're asked questions in certain ways. But at the end of the day, I think she really, every time she turned, talked to a voter, every time she was out on the stump, she really leaned into her own vision. But the headwinds were tough. I will also, though, add, of course, we lost. So I'm not here to say that didn't happen. We would much rather not have that happen. But where she campaigned, we did way better than the rest of the country. And Donald Trump did worse, to the point that you were just talking about with Pluff. The idea that people have just a well-constructed, already baked in idea about Trump and they don't need to learn anymore is just complete fallacy. I mean, his numbers are stronger today than they have ever been.
Yeah.
And that was critical for us. And we also believe this race was not just about Kamala Harris. It was Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. And we had to set that choice and that frame up. And I think that we were able to.
That's the key. So they had to address both, and they had to do it in a short time. That's essentially what she's saying. I have one more cut for but I really like this x-raying of what they were thinking, because it makes you realize, you know, these were considered options that these people had. And I also think you have to evaluate the body politic. I don't know that this is a winnable election, although, to be honest, the closer it looks as though it was, you'd think it was winnable if it was legitimate. And as you know, I think recount should have been demanded in these swing states, because I think there are outstanding questions related to bullet ballots and the like. Last cut from these insiders at the Kamala crew, and here's a bit. This is Quentin Folks, who talks about that commercial I was speaking of and how effective that was, and they're trying to punch back. But he also breaks out a couple of figures. This is the last little bit, but I wanted you to see it. I think it's instructive.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's important to put everything into context. We've very well established the time frame. And it's honestly a lot shorter than 107 days, but we had 3 core objectives to the paid media. It was to define the vice president. It was to defend her on incoming attacks, and a lot of these attacks have been baked in for the past 3.5 years. While she was the vice president, they were attacking her. She was at negative 20 something on immigration. We got that down to negative 10. Trump had a positive 22-point advantage on the economy. We got that down to 7. And we had to respond to those things. And when you sort of looked at the core issues, aside from the attacks, like trans issues are just at the bottom for voters. The economy, inflation, crime, immigration are the top issues. They were also some of the issues that she was getting attacked on. And to the element of sort of defining her and doing it in a way that sort of fit within what you're trying to do, there's a direct approach that you can take to anything, and then there is an approach that you can take that accomplishes 2 of the 3 objectives. A lot of the stuff that we did, such as talking about her prosecutorial background, and then saying that she went after transnational gangs, cartels, it was to push back pseudolly on the immigration attacks that were coming at her, as well as credentialing her background on things that were absent and standalone of the Biden administration. We did a lot of stuff about her record as AG, her record as a prosecutor, not as vice president, because it also allowed her to stand alone separate from the Biden administration. On the trans attack, obviously it was a very effective ad at the end. I ultimately don't believe that it was about the issue of trans. I think that it made her seem out of touch. And it was sort of a pseudo-economic ad underneath it, because he was saying you're going to pay for it with taxpayer money. And it was in her own words. And that's something. But we tested a ton of responses to this, direct responses. And none of them ever tested as well as basically her, talking about what she would do, to Jen's point, the future, the type of president that she would be. There were elements of it where we did try to say, and we put ads on television of her saying, you've seen all the negative attacks against me, and try to bottle it up, because I also think you have to think about the entire sentiment when you're running a paid campaign. And the trans ad, I think because of the content, a lot of people felt like it was much bigger than what it was. But to put that into context, Team Red, meaning Trump and all the super PACs that were spending on Trump's behalf, that was 7% of their total ads was on that issue.
Was that specific? So I think it was 2 ads, right?
Yeah.
There was the original, and then there was the one with Charlemagne. Yep.
And it was all Trump. So Trump spent, 37% of his, 200 million on that ad, but Trump wasn't the only spender. We were getting hit across the board. And so you have to take into account what all the super PACs are doing and play off of that. And I think that's what Trump was doing. His super PACs were hitting us on the economy, immigration, and crime. And Trump even started hitting us on immigration. And I think the veracity of which we came out of the gate and responded to that, they weren't expecting that from us. And then they backed off of that. And at that point, they started going into it. And so it is easy to say, with the kind of resources that we raised, we should have been able to do everything. But that's not the case. You have to make decisions in the time frame that we were in this race. We had to choose. And we chose to focus more of our attention on, one, driving down Trump, because that was not being done in our ecosystem on our side. And it was incredibly important that we did that, as well as defining her. And so if we spent this entire race, and not to be defensive about it at all, but if we spent this entire race pushing back on immigration attacks or crime attacks, and pushing back against trans attacks, at what point are we bringing Trump down and or introducing the vice president on our own terms? We're playing on their field. And I think that that was ultimately what went into it. But again, it wasn't something that we missed. It's just all of our testing told us that the approach that we were taking of her being more positive and talking about the economy and what she would do was a better tactic.
There you go. Thank you. I like that, again, that breakdown, because if you listen to the entire thing, he essentially takes the measure of all the different spots and the things that were working and the things that maybe weren't working as well, and the defensiveness with which they had to sort of approach a certain period of the campaign as they were getting body blows landed to Kamala Harris and her campaign. They had to strike back, and they were looking at a lot of that money that was flowing from PAC money that was dedicated to Trump that was flowing into different campaigns and media rollouts in swing states, and they had to play counterpunch. I just thought it was fascinating. Obviously, here you're looking at a losing huddle. So these things that can sound like, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. You end up at the end of this conversation going, yeah, but wait a minute, you guys lost the game, which is true. Now, again, I come back to certain things. I come back to candidate. I come back to moment in time. I also come back to a revisionist kind of view that Americans have of the past. I think there is almost a Trumpnesia, you know what I mean? This sort of amnesia about what the Trump 4 years was the first time. The guy was a mess. It was chaotic. That's why I thought that 4-year question was so, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Yeah, I am. 4 years ago, I couldn't get my personal protective equipment or whatever the hell I needed, my mask, my vaccine. It was a mess. It was utter chaos. And then you'll recall that there was a coup attempt and that the new presidential administration wasn't even granted access to anything they needed to facilitate a smooth transition during this time of national and international crisis. That's what I remember 4 years ago. So again, there's a romanticizing, though, of what it was like 4 years ago. Yeah, well, let's get back to what it was. And he just keeps saying it, right? It was great under me. It's horrible under Joe. And that's where you end up. So it's a moment in time. And I wonder if that wasn't part of it as well. Now, the last thing I would say is one of the first things I said, and that is, for me, I still feel as though it would have been only decent and only respecting the mission and the gravity of the situation to ask for a recount. I think in those swing states, I would have asked for a paper ballot recount so that every Trump bullet ballot is matched by a paper bullet ballot. That's all I would love to see. But even as I say that, I understand that in non-swing states, and I've detailed this for you before, Trump did much better than he did in 2020. And for that reason, you have to wonder if Trump voters showing up in the kind of numbers they did outside of the swing states isn't a legit reflection of Trump winning this election. But I'm sorry, just a few too many inconsistencies for me to be completely comfortable with everybody going, up, nothing to see here, I guess he won. You don't hear anything from him. It's so extraordinary. And so, again, you know me, not a conspiracy theorist particularly, but I'm ready to take a meeting with conspiracy theorists on any number of things. And sometimes just because it's coming from a conspiracy theorist doesn't mean that it's not a conspiracy. So I leave it at that. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.